By now you know that security can be fairly complex. So when you configure your controller, you can configure your SSID to use an external Radius server, and in which case you can either use the global setup on the controller, or you can call a specific list from the SSID. So if you want to create a new Radius server to use on your controller, you would go to this page, Security, AAA, Radius, and you start with Authentication. And then you create a new Radius, and that allows you to use that Radius for your security. So go there, click New, and then you enter the IP address of your Radius server. So let me put 192.132.255.8. Set up a shared secret between this controller and the Radius. There are a few options you can set. The main one is port number, and voila, your server is ready to go. Of course, if you do so, you have to do the same the other way around on the Radius server. So you would go on ICE, for example, to network devices, and then you would make sure that you add the controller as being an allowed client of the ICE server that can ask you questions about credentials. Okay, same shared secret, go down, click Submit, and now both sides can talk to each other about client authentication. Perfect. Now if I go back to my SSID and click one of the WLANs and go to Security, and if I use .1x, just because I have a Radius server, that's enough. My SSID is going to automatically go to that page, check the first server, and if it's still available, if it's responding to queries, it's going to use it to authenticate your clients. So in other words, you don't have to do anything special on the SSID here. You don't have to call that server here. You would call a server here only if you don't want to use number 1. If you have 5 of those in security and you want to use number 3, then you can call number 3 as being the first server you use for that SSID. But if you just leave the page the way it is for now, the controller is going to be clever enough to understand that you're using Radius and there is a Radius in security, so I should use it. So you don't need to call specifically any Radius there. If you do not want to use an external Radius, and if you don't have a Radius, for example, you can use the controller internal EAP server. We don't call it a Radius because it doesn't have all the options of Radius, but that's pretty much what it does. It does authentication for local EAP. So you can go to local EAP in security, general, and then you can define in profiles a new profile to use for local EAP authentication. Give it a name, and then you can choose what kind of authentication you allow on this local EAP profile on the local controller. And if you remember the autonomous APs, you can see that here we have a lot more options. You can set LEAP, EAP-Fast, TLS, and PEEP. And of course, if you click in detail, there are some other options you can set about certificates, because TLS and PEEP use certificates, but that's a little bit beyond what you need to know for the CCNA. You can keep the default for now. In the same logic, if you use EAP-Fast, there is an EAP-Fast parameter menu where you can change the default about the server identifier, the authority ID, etc. But again, you don't need to worry about too much for that in the CCNA. All right, anyway, you define your local EAP server and its functions, what kind of profile you use, and what kind of security you allow. And then if you want to use it, you just go back to the SSID, go back to security, go to the AAA server, and then you go down the page and you check local EAP authentication. If you have different profiles, then you can pick up whichever profile you want to use, and that will be allowing you to match what kind of security you use for each SSID. Here I have only one, so it's only appearing. So be careful. There has been different changes in the code between version 7 and version 8 when you do that. In the previous code, when you were using local EAP authentication, it was always and only used as a backup to global Radius authentication. In other words, if you were having a Radius defined in security, regardless of you calling that Radius from the SSID or not, the controller would always use global security setup. Even if you set local EAP authentication, it would use that local EAP authentication only if the Radius you have defined in security stopped responding. So the local EAP was always only a backup to the global definition of Radiuses. That was in code 7, and you might still find that terminology and documentation somewhere on Cisco, so be careful. That used to be the case. Today what happens is a bit more complex. If you call local EAP specifically from your SSID, you're saying you want to use local EAP. And you're going to use that profile, especially if you don't define any EAP server at the top, any Radius server. If you define in the SSID a local EAP profile, and you also call a Radius server, then you're going to use first the Radius server, and you go back to that EAP profile only as a backup. But if you don't define any authentication server at the top, then you're saying specifically, like I do here, I don't want to use the local list. I just want to use my local EAP regardless of the local list. So you see the behavior is slightly different here from what it was before in 7.0. So if I call reduce here, then only then I'm saying I want to use the server first and go back to local EAP only as a backup if the server stops responding. So you see the configuration is slightly different in 8.0 than it used to be before. It's a bit more rich as well, right? It gives you more possibility to decide for some SSIDs to use the global list, for some others to use global list as a primary and then local as a backup, and for other SSIDs to use only the local lists and never the reduce server.